Before we dive into today's story, make sure you're subscribed and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. I love seeing how far these stories travel.
"You're not her father. Richard is the one who can give Claire what you never could," my daughter shouted, her voice a blade that cut through the hush of the church. And I felt every head in the room turn like a jury against me as laughter and gasps swelled, and Aunt June's hand flew to her mouth, and Pastor Greg looked down at his notes as if the words on the page were suddenly more important than the man, standing in the back with his suit jacket clutched tight. My name, which I am telling you once and only once because it still tastes like metal when it comes up. My name is Mark Harris. I'm 44, and I'm from Akron, Ohio, and the way I say it now is not a neutral fact, but a wound. A map of all the times I'd scraped my knees to give her the smallest good things, and how those small things had become a promise I had been saving toward like a lighthouse keeper, saving kerosene for a storm, every spare dollar set aside in a shoebox in the top drawer of my kitchen for a day. I always pictured with soft light and white flowers and a look of proud, private joy when my little girl walked past me toward a life I hoped would be kind to her. The shoebox was under the elastic bands and old receipts and a faded Polaroid of her at 5. Face smeared with spaghetti and a grin that made it worth the 13-hour shifts and the second job on weekends. And I can still hear Laura's laugh from the kitchen sink when she used to call for Claire to wash up. The domestic sounds that were our background music until they weren't. There were people in the pews who had known me my whole life, neighbors who had helped me move a couch at 20, coworkers who once celebrated my promotion with beers at the diner, Samir Patel, who had taught me how to weld when I was 20 and unemployed and thought the world was a closed door, and they all turned in that instant to study the man who looked like he might be made of something less than a father, because that is how quickly a single sentence, uttered with the authority of a bride and the glitter of a reception to follow, can rewrite what everyone thought they knew. I remember everything that came before like a sequence on an old projector, Laura's hands teaching Claire to braid her hair in the cheap bathroom with a light that buzzed. The first time Claire called me Dad without being prompted because she wanted me to come to a soccer game, and I was late but I still ran and arrived with my breath in ragged pieces and her face lit up. And I thought then that the small things were the real architecture of a life. I had a job that made my knuckles calloused and my back steady. I was one of those men who put in the hours because my father had been one and his father before him, and it felt like an inheritance of duty. I took pride in the grind repairing boilers for Northside Heating, answering the phone at 3 in the morning when someone in a rental unit screamed because their pipes had frozen, offering to babysit Claire when Laura's shifts at the hospital stacked like bills in the month-end drawer. I told myself I was being practical, that love runs in routines and not grand gestures, and because the mortgage needed paying and because her shoes wore out faster than my paycheck refilled, I learned to be content with the small, faithful economy of our life. But when Claire was 14, when she began to grow taller than me and borrowed my sweaters in the winter, I started to think differently about the future because Laura started dating again, the way people do when the ache where love used to be turns into a habit of loneliness and you're tired of living alone with 2 plates on the table. I met Richard Bennett at a charity golf tournament the year Laura and he married. He was the kind of man who filled a room with a different gravity, who smelled faintly of cigars even before he introduced himself, whose laugh was practiced, and who gave money with a smile that said he expected nothing but the right kinds of gratitude in return. Richard had a house on the other side of town with a hedge cut into a perfect wave and a car that purred and a voice that told stories about art galleries and travel and people I had never met. He offered Laura a new timetable and the promise of ease. She told me they had the right to be happy, that years of struggling for us had left her tired and wanting to give Claire more than I could afford. Even more than anyone could, she said, with that soft, righteous cadence that had always made me defensive. I remember the first time Richard came to our home for dinner. He poured the wine and asked me about boilers, as if he was asking permission to like me, and I told him the truth about the job, because my hands remember the language of work, and I thought that would root me to whatever soil still remained. He smiled, the smile of a man who knows he can outbid your history, and Laura's eyes reflected relief like a light switching on. Claire sat between us and held our hands as if she were the bridge, and I believed for a while that we were building something together, that the new man did not replace me, but rather folded me into a larger picture. The saving began because it felt like an act of devotion that matched the small, steady life I had given her. I took on side jobs, fixed up a rental property I'd inherited, and I ate fewer dinners out. I declined invitations to the bar and to boys' fishing trips and watched the balance in my accounts grow with a stubbornness that was almost sacred. I kept the money in the shoebox because I didn't trust banks after the time a clerk misplaced a check, and because I liked the physical weight of it, dimes and singles and fives and a few 20s that I would iron smooth with my palm and whisper to as if the bills could hear and understand the promise I was trying to keep. I told myself the money would never be a weapon, that it would be a gift, and I rehearsed the image of Claire descending the aisle with a father who had given everything. The small private triumph of seeing what you'd built recognized. The years taught me thrift and ingenuity. I learned to negotiate on parts, to trade my time for favors, to sleep fewer hours and to find the kind of quiet pride that comes from sacrifice. My mother, Eleanor, would call to ask if I was eating right, and when I said I was, she'd reply in that sharp, loving way people from our town do. Don't stop taking care of the ones you love, because a little extra comfort would make you soft. I would smile into the phone and tell her I'd be fine, while the shoebox gathered a modest fortune that felt enormous when I wondered what I could give a child who had already given me everything. The scheme of our days rearranged itself around a horizon: clinics, recitals, late-night essays, graduation caps, and then the engagement that Laura announced over dinner with a glass of champagne and a shaky hand that I pretended not to notice. Richard asked me outright at that dinner if it would be strange for him to walk Claire down the aisle. His question was casual, conversational, like a man checking the weather. I laughed because I didn't want to be the man whose feelings had to be defended in front of wealth, and the laugh tasted like surrender. Laura said that it would be special and that she'd always wanted to give Claire a fairness she felt she'd missed in her own life. Words, swaddled in good intentions, can still come with knives inside. Claire, then 22 and luminous with the certainty of youth, said it would make her happy, and when she put her small, warm hand over mine, it felt like a benediction. "He's a good man," she said, eyes bright and unhelpful, and in that instant I felt the old architecture of my dreams begin to crack. We had arguments later that were not arguments so much as quick flames, where my words were careful and hers were absent more often than not. Laura would say we had different visions for what Claire deserved, as if deserving were measured in silk and table linens instead of time and presence. Richard offered to pay for photographers and to move us into a house near his closer to the schools, he said, and I felt my chest tighten in a way that made me breathe differently, like a man who is beginning to memorize the sound of loss. There were small cruelties that at the time I tried to laugh off. A roll of my jokes not landing at dinner when he told his versions. The way Richard would correct me in front of contractors about how to choose fixtures. The soft looks Claire would share with him across a table that said she was choosing him in a way I hadn't even known could be chosen. Friends tried to console me. Samir clapped me on the back and said, "You'll show up, Mark. That's all that matters." Aunt June sent me casseroles and platitudes, and my mother offered to come help with the house because she knew the way I couldn't say no to work. The town murmured with its small sympathies and the occasional eye roll at the drama of families. People said things like, "Kids pick what's easy," as if that solved anything. The day of the wedding dawned with a kind of electric, percussive brightness. The sunlight slanted through stained glass and dust motes, and the church smelled like lily and borrowed perfumes. My suit fit like it had a memory of the older, narrower man I used to be, and my hands shook not from the cold but from the thrum under my ribs that told me I was on the edge of something irreversible. Laura touched my shoulder as if to steady me and said, "You look good." And for a half-second I believed her, until the first chord of the processional rose and something like hot lead pooled in my stomach. The hall outside the chapel was a bustle of camera flashes and crisp tuxedos, and I watched family gather like weather moving in. When Claire stepped forward, the light around her haloed and every breath in the room seemed to hold. She had on the dress we had once discussed in the kitchen when she was 16, drawing sketches in the margins of a bill, and the thought that this day had been in progress for years like a thing coalescing made the box in my drawer prickle. I thought she might walk toward me because she had always walked toward me for the most important small things, first lost tooth, first school play, but the music did not slow for me. And then she said it, with a clarity that fell like hail, "I've decided Richard will walk me down the aisle." The words were ordinary, but the altar web was the place where ordinary speeches are transformed into verdicts because of witnesses. There was a Bida restaurant of silence, and then people looked at each other, hands covering mouths, the officiant's fingers tightening on the hymn book. I remember seeing Tom Alvarez, my coworker, look at me with the blank, embarrassed expression men give other men when they don't know whether to offer their arm or look away. I remember Karen Mitchell, the woman who had promoted me 6 years prior and who had once mentored me into asking for overtime, nodding like a judge who had just observed a procedural irregularity. My stomach closed like a fist. Someone can't remember who laughed inappropriately, as if laughter could salvage the situation, and then murmurs rippled through the congregation like wind through dead leaves, gossip forming like mold. Really? Whispered a voice behind me. Claire's face was resolute as a country's border. Her jaw set in that way that told me she had weighted the world and found it wanting of me. Humiliation is a particular weather. It's not just embarrassment, it is a lowering of status in the eyes of people whose opinions you thought mattered or once mattered. It is the sudden redrawing of the map where you're the man with the closed wallet and the wrong coat. And because I had spent years setting aside money to make that day perfect in a way that would seal our history in light and joy, the humiliation cut like a financial ledger thrown across the table, the numbers stark and uncompromising. The shoebox in the drawer that had felt like a promise now felt like a child's toy that had been refused in front of peers. My savings, my strategy, had been dismissed by a daughter who had decided her life would be led by a man with a different bank account and a better tie. After the vows were reassembled and the music restarted with a stilted professional calm, I sat like something waiting to be disposed of, and when Claire passed me on her way back to take a seat beside Richard, she did not look at me. The whole congregation had been rewired into spectators of my disgrace. I left before the reception. I could have stayed, could have clung to a fork and eaten the food and pretended everything was theater, but the feeling of being on stage as a fool was a weight I couldn't wear. In the church parking lot, the lights seemed too bright, and cars looked like lanterns in a world I no longer knew how to belong to. I walked without thinking, and the shoebox in the drawer felt suddenly petty. The money inside a currency of things that could be bought but couldn't buy back love. I drove to the river where the factories used to blow steam like old giants. The water moved in patient, indifferent rhythms, and I imagined dumping the shoebox into the current and watching boreal coins vanish into a place that doesn't ask why. Instead, I drove home and pulled the shoebox from under a stack of old catalogs and sat at the kitchen table where we had had so many small dinners and took the first breath in a long time that felt like it belonged entirely to me. For months after, the house felt like a stage set that someone had taken the letters off of. Laura seemed reluctant to look me in the eye, not out of shame but out of guilt's cousin. The conviction that she had made a choice that was the only smart one. Claire texted the first weeks with photographs of honeymoon gifts and glossy, curated moments that looked like they belonged to a life I had intended to help build, but no longer recognized as mine. Richard came by sometimes under the pretense of repairs, offering checks for small things, as if money were a bandage to be wrapped around the ragged edges of human discomfort. I spent my nights walking the neighborhood, hands in my pockets, the shoebox's weight a private ballast. People in town sniffed and pointed, politely and then less politely, and the rumor mill churned. He wasn't supportive enough, said one. He didn't have the means, offered another. All of them had all the mercy of a thermostat consistent, mechanical. I won't pretend I moved through those months without fury. There were nights I woke with my heart so loud I thought it might alarm the neighbors. Nights when I imagined standing in front of the reception and demanding an accounting of decency. But the one thing long practice had taught me was the economy of patience. Angry, loud gestures were the currency of people who had never had to save for something real. So I turned my anger into motion. I kept working my day job and took one of the rental units and renovated it using my own 2 hands, sweat and calluses replacing the need for pity. I took apart the old boat my brother had left me and turned its wood into a table I sold at the local market. I'd bartended once a week to meet ends and learned to listen to other people's griefs in a way that made me less lonely, more bonded to the ordinary toughness of men and women who show up and sweat and do not ask for applause. More quietly, I invested the shoebox in a way that surprised me. It wasn't a get-rich-quick scheme. It was a modest plan. I bought a small diner on the edge of town that had a faulty hood fan and a rumor of bad health code days but which had good bones, the kind of place where the regulars love the owners as part of the furniture. The owner, Gloria, was ready to retire and had inherited the diner from her husband. She needed someone who could keep the place as it was, not remodel it into a sleek faux hipster temple. I made a plan that fit the rhythm of my life. Work the mornings, repair the boilers in the afternoons. The diner became a place where I could anchor myself to a community that hadn't judged me entirely. People came for pancakes that weren't Instagrammable, but were honest, for coffee poured with the economy of a man who had watched storms from his porch and learned how to fix the roof. I put my hands into the dough of things and felt something like repair happening in me. Richard's life, by contrast, did not follow my trajectory. He had been a man who made a spectacle of his wealth and relied upon it to lubricate the gears of his influence. He owned an investment company that thrummed with the buzz of other people's money. He hosted fundraisers with oysters and polite laughter, and he financed charities with a flourish that made him the kind of man who had people wanting to sit near him at dinner. For a while, his money was as unassailable as a fortress. But the world is not gentle with people who build only on borrowed applause. An economic downturn hit that particular sector of investments, and his firm's high-risk options that had once doubled and tripled returns suddenly showed hemorrhaging red lines. There were regulatory inquiries, a couple of bad bets on a tech company that burned like dry grass, and whispers of mismanagement that grew into an official investigation. I watched this from a distance, not because I had orchestrated it, but because the world kept turning and sometimes the weight of pretense collapses under its own architecture. Articles in the paper spoke of market instability and over-leveraged portfolios, and Richard Bennett's name appeared alongside press releases in a way that smelled like exposure. What I didn't do at first is what many expecting revenge stories think the hurt man should do. I didn't call for his ruin. I didn't write anonymous letters or wave banners outside his office. My instinct was not lawless revenge. It was boundary. The decisive move that shifted the balance wasn't a clever scheme to humiliate him back, that had the taste of juvenile victory. My move was to detach. I stopped showing up at events where his presence could shadow mine. I stopped answering the calls from people who wanted to commiserate and then gossip. The small, patient accumulation of my work, my hands in the diner on weekday mornings, fixing motors in the afternoon, was itself a kind of turning. When the investigation into Richard's firm widened, when news anchors dissected his decisions like they were a car accident everyone felt compelled to watch, I did not crow. I simply continued to live. The consequence followed like season. Richard's fall was public and messy. Board members testified about meetings where cushions were offered for decisions that should have been made on merit. Whistleblowers spoke of conferences with champagne and promises that hadn't been kept. Clients sued. The headlines moved in syllables. Bennett Capital under scrutiny. Philanthropy questioned after financial missteps. Wealthy patron faces investigations. The society people who had once queued to be seen at his parties now avoided each other's gazes at the grocery store. There were articles that took a morbid interest in which cars remained in his driveway. His house that had once seemed a fortress began to look like a stage set that had lost its props. I kept my head down in the diner, serving eggs and bacon to men who'd once nodded at him in a golf shirt, listening to how small the world felt sometimes when one human's collapse turned into everyone else's dinner conversation. Meanwhile, on the inside, Laura's fortune had been partially stitched to his. They had enjoyed a life of conveniences she had always wanted, and when his wealth contracted, the conveniences contracted too. She called once in a voice I didn't recognize, asking for help with bills and with a tone that pretended to be casual and afraid in equal measure. "Mark," she said, "we're in a tough spot." And the years slid backward to nights when we had pooled our resources to get Claire through a college class she insisted she wanted, to me fixing a leaky roof with duct tape and basic supplies. I could have gone over and helped. I could have handed over money, like a man paying a toll to absolve someone else's conscience. But the saving had always been for Claire's wedding, a moment we'd both imagined differently, and that moment had been used to write me out of my daughter's life in public. The choice wasn't simply about money. It was about dignity. Claire didn't come to me that winter. Pride has its own geography, and she had sheltered herself in the warmth of the family she had chosen. Richard's decline happened like a public illness. Some nights he was on the local news explaining his decisions. Some mornings his name was a whisper on the street. As his resources dwindled, the people who had once courted his favor distanced themselves, a dramatic, fast-moving social exodus. Laura's calls increased in frequency and desperation. There was a coldness in her voice that was not the iciness of malice, but the brittle fear of someone who had lived on the periphery of a furnace and then found the fire out. When a year had drifted past and the leaves were brittle from an early frost, Claire finally came to the diner on a January afternoon, wet hair sticking to the collar of a coat that had seen better days. The bell over the door jingled with a familiarity that used to be signal. She came in not like a conqueror, but like a woman with the hum of someone who has lost money and is now looking for currency she cannot quantify. Our eyes met, and for a fraction it was as if the years peeled away. She was the same child who'd once hidden behind the drapes and popped out to make me laugh, but then the present rushed back like cold water. She sat at a corner booth and ordered coffee, her hands trembling despite the composure in her voice. We spoke with care I hadn't expected. We spoke about weather and the diner and nothing until finally she said, "Dad, I'm sorry." And her voice was a small thing, an apology dropped into a well. The raw betrayal the moment she had chosen someone else at the altar was a fresh, cold scar. I had rehearsed lines for vengeance in the privacy of nights, clever humiliations that would equalize the ledger. But when she sat there, fragile like a bird after a window strike, the lashing wind of the past didn't feel like something that wanted a spectacle. Revenge in cheap heroic stories demands fireworks. Real life grants you a slow, honest accountability. I told her, "You made your choice." And my voice was the exact speed of my decision. Not triumphant, not wounded in a way that begged for pity, but steady. She cried then, but her tears were for the loss of the fortress they'd relied on, and for the sudden exposure to consequences they had never imagined. She asked for money to make rent, to help Richard with legal fees, anything, and when she mentioned Richard, it was as if saying his name burned her. The people around town watched this too. Those who had seen me leave the reception waited, curious to see if I would open the shoebox and return it as a bombshell. It never occurred to me to do that. I slid a check across the diner counter once, small, the kind that would patch a hole in a roof but not rebuild a house, and when I handed it to Claire, her face registered shock and something like relief. She said, "Why are you doing this?" And I said, "Because I won't be the architect of your poverty," which is a clumsy sentence to carry all the layers of what I felt, but it held the truth. I refused to be the man she used to belittle me into being, and I refused to be the bank when I'd been treated like spare change. My gesture, modest as it was a delineation. She was furious then, and for a moment I saw the old defiant girl emerge, and she spat at me words that hurt because they were true. "You could have been more," she said. I shrugged inwardly at the accusation that I had not done enough. My life had been a ledger of unshowy courage, of small, consistent acts. But she wanted more spectacle, more status, and in the end she had chosen the glitter rather than the work. Richard's legal troubles escalated into headline-grabbing hearings. They aired snippets of calls and emails that looked like confessions, and I watched as men who wore his compliments at parties like shawls huddled away from cameras that wanted to know who would remain when the music stopped. There was a settlement that came with a bankruptcy and with apologies that read like legal counsel written them. The social collapse was not violent. It was simply a retraction of attention. Townspeople who had once been eager to be seen at his house now pretended not to run into him at the hardware store. Laura's face hollowed in ways that are familiar to people who have spent lives on a tightrope. The look of someone balancing fear and the necessity of moving forward in a world where financial security is slipping like a hand on glass. I kept my head down. I fixed the diner menu to include a dinner special called Workman's Plate, and people came because it reminded them of their fathers and of the honest economy of food. Business picked up as if on schedule, and the regulars sometimes stayed after hours to talk about the world, about the things that mattered. I found a small joy in being a man who could read a room and make someone coffee with the sympathetic accuracy of a man who has held his own coffee cup in doubt more times than he'd like to admit. My hands moved on the steering wheel of my old truck like a map of the life I had accepted. They had not made me invulnerable, but they had taught me to travel steady. There were still nights, late at the diner, when loneliness arrived like an old friend and sat across from me, and I talked to myself about the fairness of things and the choices people make. The memory of Claire's voice at the wedding was a loop sometimes. It wasn't rage so much as the sting of unacknowledged effort. I had wanted her to have a wedding that would close the loop on a life of scrape and strife, not because I wanted credit, but because I wanted love to be recognized. When she had replaced me with a man who could buy comfort, the crowd's laughter at the church had been the final thing. The community had learned a new hierarchy and my place in it had been shifted. Months later, after the legal dust had settled, and Richard had lost properties and favors like leaves in an early autumn, Claire found herself standing before the diner door again. She had come not with the arrogance of the bride, but with the humility of someone who had watched the scaffolding of her life be dismantled by market forces and by the poor choices of adults who had promised safe ground and then retreated. She knocked, and when I opened the door, she stood there, smaller somehow, the makeup of privilege rubbed off like an old poster. She said, "Can I come in?" And the words were ordinary. I let her in. The scene in the diner was one of private reconciliation that didn't feel neat enough to be called such. There were patrons eating their evening dinners, the hum of conversation like a river around our small island. Claire ordered simple things, soup, bread, and when she talked, she swallowed words and searched for the right ones. She admitted haltingly that she'd been wrong to humiliate me, that she'd been thoughtless and influenced. The confession came like someone returning a borrowed book late and finding the pages bent. She asked if she could stay with me for a while until she found her feet finding work, paying rent, rebuilding what had been lost. I looked at her, at the woman she had become, and felt the old fatherly impulse to take on the scaffolding of another's life, to hold and to steady. To some men that would be the moment they'd unveil a master plan of revenge. To some men that would be the moment they'd burn the world down in theater. I did neither. Instead, I told her no. The refusal was not cruelty, but an arithmetic of dignity. I could have made room in my life for her and given her shelter and warmth and told her that the cost to me was negligible. But I had spent months healing from the wound of being publicly dismissed before her peers, and I had learned that allowing myself to be used as the safety net after such public betrayal would be to acquiesce in the lessons she would take from that moment, that money and convenience were an appropriate replacement for loyalty if it were offered. I had not promised to be her bank. I had promised to be her father. A father teaches boundaries as much as he teaches love. I said, "You chose," and those words had the flatness of a ledger. I walked her to the door and gave her the small check I'd already written, enough to cover seed money for an apartment and a few weeks' rent, and I handed it to her like a tool, not a chain. She left in a kind of stunned fury that looked like heartbreak. She blamed me for a while in phone calls that were cold and then angry and then pleading. The town took sides subtly. Some defended me, some said I'd been hard, some said I'd done the noble thing. Richard's name dwindled into the kinds of stories people tell over drinks about men who overspend and then lose everything, a cautionary tale. Laura's calls became less frequent and then ceased, the silence between us a place that held the shape of what had been. Claire tried to find employment, anything that paid. Some days she came by the diner for coffee on breaks from interviews. She helped sometimes in the kitchen, washing dishes, then waiting tables for tips that made her hands ache and taught her humility. I watched her grow again in ways that felt not like regrowth, but like a plant replanted and given time. She learned how to budget, how to tell the truth in uncomfortable moments, how to apologize fully instead of shedding the skin of apology like an act. It was not a clean arc from villain to virtue. She still had her moments of defense and slyness and stubborn pride. But the man who had once been able to show her off as an accessory could no longer shield her from the consequences of choices she'd made. And I found myself steadier in a life that was less about saving for a single luminous night and more about building consistent, modest goodness. There were social ripples that followed. Richard's former friends had to reckon with the scenes they'd helped prop up. Some of them called me and asked if I'd testify about the way he managed things, curious whether my quiet, practical investments could serve as an example. I declined most of those requests because the things I had learned were about boundaries, not publicity. There were whispers that I had gained from his fall, that I'd orchestrated something, and the town's imagination loves a conspiracy. I took what came with the patience of a man who knows his own hours. My diner grew into a place where people who had been humiliated could come and not be seen as spectacles. People who had been cast off by systems of privilege found here a kitchen that didn't judge. Claire's life, after she stopped trying to wear the shoes of someone else, grew a kind of rough, honest dignity. She found a job in town at a nonprofit, one that paid little but fed her in ways that were not monetary. She called me sometimes about the little things, how to fix a clogged sink, where to buy a cheap but reliable mattress, and each call recalibrated the music between us. She asked for forgiveness more than once, and I offered it not as an eraser but as a compass course. We had to navigate from here forward differently. There were times when she missed the mark and I would scold her because love had taught me that gentleness without firmness is negligence. The final collapse for Richard came in a way that was mercifully unspectacular. His house was sold in pieces, council took what they could, and he moved to a smaller apartment and then out of state. Occasionally, I'd hear rumors he'd been dining at a cheap cafe alone in another city, the bright suits replaced by thrifted jackets. The world moved on, as it does, and people found other fingers to point with. Laura remarried quietly to a family friend who owned a small landscaping business, and who preferred not to mix public social life with financial spectacle. She sent holiday cards a few years later with a brief note about Claire's new job and a short line about gratitude. I folded the card into the drawer with other small, official things, and then called my mother, and we talked about the children on both sides of the family. I walked away from those years not unscarred but honest. Wounds remained. There are nights when the memory of the church, the hush and the laughter, returns, and I feel my chest tighten to the shape of that day. But so does a certain relief that comes from not having been reduced by someone else's vote. I have learned the economic truth that dignity is not purchased by the largest credit card in the room, but by the small currencies we exchange with steadiness. Time kept, presents offered, work done without applause. In the diner the other day, a young father came in with his small daughter, and they sat in the booth my family used to occupy years ago. And when he pulled out his wallet to buy a toy for his child, I felt nothing but an old kindly recognition. The community that had once whispered now speaks of the diner like it's a sturdy thing in town, a place you can experiment with being human. My mother still calls. Sometimes she brings pies and stays long enough to ask if I'm eating well. When people ask me now at the hardware store, at the counter, sometimes over coffee, what it was like to have been humiliated and then to have outlived that humiliation, I tell them the truth in as few words as possible, that humiliation is a thing you can survive if you have the wherewithal to convert shame into work. You can let a wound become an anthem and then a pattern, or you can let it teach you where to build boundaries. The last time Claire and I had a dinner together after she found a job and moved into a small apartment, we ate slowly. She said, "Dad, I was wrong." And I answered, "I know," because that was the simplest, truest thing I could say. She cried then, quietly, with the small humility of someone who had been privileged and then unprivileged, and had to learn the terms of life again. I left the town for a week one summer after the diner turned a small profit and drove to the lake where my father used to take me. I sat in a lawn chair at dusk and watched the surface of the water catch the light and thought of what revenge really is. It's not about orchestrating someone's downfall so much as stepping out of the orbit they expected you to remain in, and letting the consequences of their choices come home. If they wanted to build their lives on the precarious scaffolding of wealth and public favor, then when that scaffolding collapsed, they had to taste the same cold air everyone else must sometimes eat. It felt ruthless and fair at once. There were smaller, quieter gratifications. A woman named Maya, who had once been a bridesmaid at Claire's wedding, started bringing me tomatoes from her garden. An old man who had mocked me in the pews the day of the wedding became a regular at the diner and left a tip with a note that said, "You did all right, son. I didn't need those validations to live." They were small, human icing. The bigger thing was the steady peace of waking to a day where my priorities weren't measured against someone else's headline. I had wanted to give my daughter the wedding of her dreams because I thought it would be a sign that I'd done everything right. What I eventually learned is that the right thing is not always a single celebratory night, but a life that can be trusted to be consistent and true when circumstances shift. When the town gathered for a memorial some years later, and people asked about the man who had built the big house down by the river, the conversations were small. Didn't he used to throw great parties? He had some bad timing with investments. People tilting their heads, small moral mathematics. Claire did not attend that memorial. She had found other rhythms and other ways to live. She came into the diner one evening years after the collapse and left a note on the counter, simple handwriting, that said, "Thank you." I kept the note in a drawer not because I needed absolution, but because it was a marker on the long road of our relationship. Not redeemed in a single blaze of dramatic contrition, but repaired and steadied through small acts and firm boundaries. The final act I took that changed my life was not a dramatic unmasking or a legal deposition. It was the slow, constant reorientation of my days toward honest labor and away from the idea that my worth was negotiable on the same exchange where people buy their reputations. I chose to be the man who opened the diner at 5 in the morning, who fixed a boiler at noon, who came home to a simple dinner and a collar from my mother. I chose to refuse the role of bank or trapeze net for people who had publicly scoffed at me. That choice cost me certain versions of family and certain illusions of unconditional love, but it preserved the core of what I had to give, a presence that was not for sale. In the end, the visible consequence for the betrayer, the stepfather who had offered a glittering life and then watched it crumble, was precisely what the story needed to make the scale balance. A public unraveling, legal entanglements, a social exile that made him less of a phantom and more of a cautionary tale. The family who had once chosen him found themselves on the hard ground when the scaffolding fell, and they had to choose again how they would live without that crutch. My daughter learned, as many children must, that some comforts are fragile and that people who offer them may fail to keep them. She also learned, slowly and painfully, the meaning of asking for forgiveness and the price that sometimes accompanies it. I walk differently now through town. There's a kind of quiet respect that people give me, and I give it right back because respect, once earned and squandered and earned again, is a fragile currency. I carry the scars of humiliation like the ridges of a road I have traveled. They are not pretty and they are not small, but they mark a path. If you ask me whether I regret the years I spent saving, the nights I worked 2 jobs, the day I walked out of a church as my daughter found a different idea of a father, my answer is complex. I regret the moment of betrayal, the sting, and the publicness of it, but I do not regret the muscle I built from carrying my own burdens. There is a lesson at the end of this long, messy story that I can gift without ceremony. People will sometimes choose what shines over what has quietly held them, and when that happens, the only revenge worth having is building a life that does not depend on their approval.
Betrayal leaves scars, but sometimes it also leaves lessons. What lesson did this story leave with you? Share it in the comments, and let's see how many of us have walked through the same kind of fire. And if you want more stories like this, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss the next one.